The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the show to all of our progressive friends and viewers and listeners. I've got progressive stuff from a presidential candidate to tell you about today. This is exciting. We don't always have this, Lewis. I'm talking of Bernie Sanders, the independent senator from Vermont who is running as a Democrat in the Democratic primary for the presidential nomination of 2016. Bernie Sanders, I have video of Bernie Sanders destroying not only corporate media, but also Republicans in one fell swoop. This is a mini press conference that Sanders gave in Dubuque, Iowa, just minutes after speaking to 2,000 people there, decided to take questions from the press. Here is part one. Bernie Sanders completely shutting down the Bernie versus Hillary. Let's see if we can induce them to smear each other or to get Bernie to smear Hillary. Bernie Sanders shutting it down, indicting corporate media and saying, hey, we disagree on policy. This is politics. Take a look.
Okay. Hi. Yes. You, in your speech tonight, you said you won't criticize or attack Hillary Clinton, certainly, but you did seem to draw some implicit contrast when you said you don't take money from super PACs and you voted against the Iraq War.
So what I said is that corporate media talks about all kinds of issues except the most important issues. Okay? And time after time, I'm being asked to criticize Hillary Clinton. That's the sport that you guys like. The reason this campaign is doing well because we're talking about the issues that impact the American people. I've known Hillary Clinton for 25 years. I like her, I respect her. I disagree with her on a number of issues. No great secret. I oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Okay? I want to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour.
Doesn't she?
No, not to the best of my knowledge, no. I believe I am opposed to the Keystone Pipeline. Okay, I voted against the war in Iraq. I voted against the USA Patriot Act. These are differences of opinions that we will discuss. But the issue that I want to be talking about is the collapse of the American middle class. You guys going to write about that? Yeah. Is that an important issue? Please do. The need to create millions of decent paying jobs. The obscenity of the kind of level of income and wealth inequality that we have today. The reason our campaign is doing well is because people are responding to those issues. So I am not going to get into the game of sitting around attacking Hillary Clinton. We disagree. We're going to have, if I have anything to say about it, a respectful and intelligent debate.
This is, we hear about red meat on the right. Red meat on the right is talking about guns and abortion and gays and religion and all of the nonsense that we hear time after time from the Republican Party. Here is Bernie Sanders saying the corporate media is at fault for creating this nonsense battle where you try to get me to smear Hillary. I get along with Hillary. I respect Hillary. We have policy differences. And let's be honest, we have serious issues to discuss here. Job creation, the income and wealth inequality that is overtaking this country, the collapse of the middle class. Contrast this, Lewis, from the way that Republicans in the primary are going about their campaigns. Bernie Sanders it's an explosion of substantive discussion of issues.
And does it make for good ratings? I don't know. Of course, these media outlets are businesses, and they love the red meat that the Republicans are throwing around. I mean, that's just great television, and there's no denying that.
No question about it. And that's the issue, is Bernie Sanders saying, hey, you know what? Instead of taking the bait from you and starting to smear Hillary Clinton, who by and large I agree with and respect, except on issues that he mentioned, Keystone XL and TPP and the other issues that Bernie mentioned, let's just have a better conversation here about the real issues affecting us broadly speaking. Yet that's not as interesting as teeing it up for Donald Trump to say that Rosie O'Donnell is a fat pig, right? That's very different. And it's very clear where a lot of voters want to see this campaign go. Let's now go to a second answer from Bernie from this exact same little press conference, where he was asked a really good question that we talk about, which is, why do people vote against their own interest? Why vote for the candidates that would, for example, disproportionately give tax cuts to the rich when you yourself would be hurt by that policy as someone who is maybe in the middle class or someone who is poor? And here's Bernie Sanders attempting to answer the question.
Why do you think working class people in America vote against their economic self-interest?
That's a good question. And if I knew all of the complete answer to that, I'd be a lot smarter than I am. But this is what I will tell you. I think the Republicans have done a brilliant job over the years. They're very smart guys in dividing people on a million different issues. They divide people on gay marriage. They divide people on abortion. They divide people on immigration. And what my job is, and it's not just in blue states, believe me, we're going to go to red states, we're going to go to conservative states, is to bring working people together around an agenda that works for their kids and works for their parents. Raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Having a trade policy that creates jobs in America, not in China. Making sure that all of our kids can get a college education regardless of their income.
Spot on. This is a planned and specific tactic, particularly from Republicans, which is to divide people. If you want to go out there and do economic policy as a Republican that hurts middle and lower income Americans and disproportionately helps the very rich, what's the best way to do it? Distract the voters with stuff like, we need to stand strong for our morals by opposing gay marriage or abortion, or we need prayer in schools. This is an effective tactic. As Bernie Sanders points out, Lewis, you can bamboozle people on the broader issues that are destroying our society, like inequality, by dividing people among these social issues, which, quite frankly, should be issues of 100 years ago. They should not be issues of today.
But still, for many of those people, those social issues are more important.
And the part of the reason why is because they've been convinced by politicians that those are important issues because they're turned into controversies that should not be.
That is true. That is true. And, you look at some of these people and you can't help but think that ignorance is bliss,
To go to your earlier point, Lewis, the media, corporate media, wants a reality TV show, a real debate that covers real world issues. The issues Bernie Sanders is talking about is too boring for corporate media ratings. They would rather cover Trump because he draws ratings. It has nothing to do with who's more qualified to be president. No question about that. The contrast has not been this clear for a while between the candidates. I want to continue with Bernie Sanders just on a rampage, destroying. He's like I don't even know what analogy to use, Lewis, that wouldn't be offensive because we do sometimes have natural disasters, but he is sort of like a tornado coming through the calm of corporate media status quo on elections, saying you're destroying the real discussion about elections. You're dividing people with these fake issues. He is coming through it much like a tornado. And now Bernie Sanders has absolutely blasted the New York Times Magazine for asking about his hair. This is a condensed excerpt from an interview done of Bernie Sanders by Anna Marie Cox. We're going to put it up on the screen for you here, and we'll work through it. And this is the conversation that took place. Bernie was asked by Anna Marie Cox, do you think it's fair that Hillary's hair gets a lot more scrutiny than yours does? And Bernie says, Hillary's hair gets more scrutiny than my hair? And Anna Marie Cox responds, yeah. And Bernie says, is that what you're asking? And Anna Marie Cox says, yeah. And Bernie Sanders says, okay, Anna, I don't mean to be rude here. I'm running for president of the United States on serious issues, okay? Do you have serious questions? And Anna Marie Cox responds, I can defend that as a serious question. There's a gendered reason. And then Bernie Sanders says, dropping the hammer, when the media worries about what Hillary's hair looks like or what my hair looks like, that's a real problem. We have millions of people who are struggling to keep their heads above water, who want to know what candidates can do to improve their lives. And the media will very often spend more time worrying about hair than the fact that we're the only major country on earth that doesn't guarantee health care to all people. Anna Marie Cox trying to sort of rescue it, saying, well, it's also true that the media pays more attention to what female candidates look like than what male candidates look like. And Bernie says that may be, and it's absolutely wrong. Yes, Lewis, there is a fragment of a relevant topic here, which is the appearance of female candidates seems to be more of a factor than the appearance of male candidates. We've talked before about how the issue of Hillary's age has been made more of an issue than the issue of Mitt Romney's age in the 2012 election, even though they're essentially the same age. We know that. But to sit down with the guy who is the issues guy and ask about hair, I think Bernie's answer should have been, when he's asked, why does the media spend more time talking about Hillary's hair than your hair? It should have been, you tell me, Anna Marie Cox from the New York Times Magazine, why do you people in corporate media ask about hair? That's really the question I would love to hear an answer to.
Yeah, not really a question that I think is important. You're right, though. It is sad. I mean, Hillary probably has a team of people who are just keeping track of what she looks like and what her hair looks like and what she's wearing and all of that, because unfortunately, it does have an impact on your campaign and your chances.
If you're the New York Times, why even print this? I mean, this was a condensed summary of the interview. You don't even really have to print this, right? If I were the New York Times, I would say, you know what, we're going to skip that altogether because it really didn't go well, because it is a very accurate and precise indictment of much of what's wrong with the corporate media narrative around this election.
Yeah, well, it's good that they left it in. Perhaps they wanted people to realize that, or they thought people would just get a kick out of this interaction.
The death of a black prison inmate has been ruled a homicide. Over 12 witnesses have said that they saw 20 officers kicking and punching him. The New York Times reports that on the evening of April 21st in Building 21 at the Fishkill Correctional Facility, Samuel Harrell, an inmate with a history of erratic behavior linked to bipolar disorder, packed his bags and announced he was going home. Of course, he wasn't going home. He still had several years left to serve on his drug sentence. And shortly thereafter, he got into a confrontation with corrections officers. He was thrown to the floor and handcuffed. And as many as 20 officers, including members of a group known as the Prison Beat-Up Squad, repeatedly kicked and punched Mr. Harrell, who, as I mentioned, is African American, with some of the officers reportedly shouting racial slurs, according to more than a dozen inmate witnesses. Edwin Pearson, an inmate who watched from a nearby bathroom, said, like he was a trampoline, they were just jumping on him. Mr. Harrell was then reportedly thrown or dragged down the staircase. One inmate reported seeing him lying on the staircase landing, quote, bent in an impossible position. Corrections officer called for an ambulance. According to medical records, the officers mentioned nothing about the physical encounters that over 12 witnesses say took place. Records show that they told the ambulance crew that Mr. Harrell probably OD'd on K2, a synthetic form of marijuana. He ultimately died. An autopsy was done, and the autopsy revealed, number one, there were no illicit drugs in his system, Lewis. If this was all the result of K2, you would think that hours later there would be some evidence of K2 in his system, but there was not, only evidence of antidepressants and tobacco. He did, however, have cuts and bruises on his head, on his extremities, which does support the story told by the 12 plus inmates who claim to have seen 20 officers beating this man. The autopsy has now said plainly and clearly, this was a death by homicide. Has anyone been disciplined at the Fishkill facility? No. No officers have been disciplined, and in fact, it's quite the opposite. Inmate witnesses at Fishkill say that they are the ones that have been punished. Several inmates have described being put into solitary confinement and threatened with violence after speaking with the family and lawyers of the victim, as well as news reporters. The officers had the testicular fortitude to claim that Mr. Harrell overdosed, even though no drugs were found in his system. The autopsy shows that he was covered in cuts and bruises and that this was a homicide. It is mind-boggling that the prison officers have so casually tried to dismiss the death as, this guy just OD'd.
Yeah, and so this is something we hear about because the person in question died.
Right.
And imagine just how many unnecessary and brutal beatings have taken place here over the years that we never hear about because, well, it doesn't end up like this. Yeah,
these are not isolated incidents, and when we don't have a death, it's even less likely that we will ever hear about this. This is part of the problem with mass incarceration and our prison system, just one of the many problems. This explanation from the officers is tantamount to an officer saying, listen, we walked over to his cell and the guy just exploded or something. And then the medical examiner does an autopsy and says, well, There's no evidence of that. I mean, we have his body intact. It didn't explode, but he appears to have been brutally beaten all over his body. And then the officers say, yep, just exploded, spontaneously exploded. That's all we saw.
Yep. Sounds like it's like something out of a movie, really, or a TV show. And it's, I hope there are charges here. There should be.
We will follow it and let you know if ultimately charges happen. Nobody, as I mentioned, even disciplined as of this morning. Let's take a break. Big show for you today, including a former NRA official who is leading a movement against the death penalty. I'll talk to him later in the show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Remember that if you ever shop on Amazon.com, the shopping you do can support our program. If you shop after going to davidpakman.com and clicking on the Amazon banner, I recommend bookmarking the link and using it whenever you shop. You can also become a David Pakman Show member at davidpakman.com/membership. That's the main funding source for this program. We mostly fund our operations through memberships, and we have some great perks available for members as well. Today's new member of the day is Margaret Jones. Margaret, thank you so much for being a member. Join Margaret at davidpakman.com/membership. We have a terrific double dose of Hatriot Mail for you today.
It's like a mandatory transvaginal ultrasound for your mind. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
All right, we've got a double dose of hate this week. These are, let's see if you can figure out, Lewis, the connection between these two Hatriot Mails. Here's the first one. Take a listen.
This guy, David Pakman, is a complete idiot, as well as his zombie sidekick. No common sense at all. Are these kids on Valium or something?
That is the first. And then the second, looking to draw the similarities out, is as follows.
Looking good, David. Not shaving makes you look like a male. No transgenders here, right? Right?
All right, Lewis, let me open it up to you. What do you see as the similarities between these two Hatriot Mails?
The similarities? I don't know. That we're ignorant transgenders? What is it?
It is that they are irrational attacks based merely on insults, like accusing us of being zombies or morons or idiots or transgender as an attack. They are not substantive critiques, which is the sort of calling card of the American Hatriot. All right, Lewis's audio has cut out, which is stunning. We continue to work with Lewis on resolving his audio problems. Lewis, I'm going to full steam ahead, and you see what you can do as far as that goes, and just let me know if you get it resolved. Clap your hands or maybe punch yourself in the face. Call attention to yourself, and then I will know that you need to talk to me. Let's talk a little bit about George Zimmerman. George Zimmerman is now involved in a headline that you would see it and think that it has to be fake. Some headlines that sound fake, but they've been real that we've discussed on the show before are, for example, Santorum comes behind in a three-way and blasts Romney at a coming Georgia rally. That's a real headline, even though it sounds fake. Another one we've done, teacher masturbates in hallway after beating student. Sounds kind of fake, but it is real. And now the headline, which sounds like an Onion headline, but it is all too real, is that George Zimmerman is selling Confederate flag paintings at a Muslim-free gun store. George Zimmerman is selling prints of his Confederate flag painting at a gun store that made headlines earlier this year for deeming itself a Muslim-free zone. As a reminder, George Zimmerman is the guy who shot and killed unarmed teen Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida, back in 2012. He was ultimately acquitted after a month-long trial that was captivating to much of the United States. If you want to buy one of these numbered prints of George Zimmerman's online for $50, you get entered into a raffle to win the original Confederate flag painting. A statement on the Florida Gun Supplies website speculates that the original painting could be worth up to $100,000. That happens to be the price that Zimmerman's last painting sold for on eBay. You may remember that it's just shocking that George Zimmerman sold a painting for about $100,000 on eBay. After the shootings in Chattanooga in July, Florida Gun Supplies owner Andy Hallinan posted a controversial video on YouTube saying he is now going to be turning away Muslims who want to shop at his gun store. Hallinan and Zimmerman will be splitting the proceeds from the prints to cover the legal fees expected from banning Muslims from your store. Tea Party bingo, right? George Zimmerman, Confederate flag, pro-gun, anti-Muslim. That is a winning bingo card if I've ever heard one in conservative bingo. It's like a sort of right-wing Mad Libs. And George Zimmerman is certainly winning the game. That is for absolutely certain. Here's an insane story. You might remember the Duggar family. The Duggar family, Jim, Bob, and Michelle Duggar, are the stars of this TLC reality show, which is now canceled, called 19 Kids and Counting. They're a Christian family that does not believe in contraception, as evidenced by the fact that they have 19 children. Their son, Josh Duggar, was embroiled in a controversy some months ago because he turns out to have molested multiple young girls, including some of his sisters, and everything exploded. Everything blew up for the Duggar family. It was abundantly clear that the parents, Jim, Bob, and Michelle Duggar, were at least tangentially, if not directly and instrumentally involved in the cover-up of this child sex abuse. Now, David Badash over at the New Civil Rights Movement is reporting that Jim, Bob, and Michelle Duggar have pitched a new reality TV show to TLC where they will be essentially functioning as child sex abuse counselors based on their experience within their family. The idea is they are going to show up as the sort of experts on how to deal with child sex abuse in families or amongst individuals, who knows what. And this is just absolutely offensive. I mean, number one, these are two individuals who, if anything, are partly to blame for the cover-up of the child sex abuse. And they want to do a new reality show where they are framed, I guess their desire is to be framed as the experts on dealing with child sex abuse. Another factor here, according to a branding expert who spoke last month, it seems that financially, things are not going so well for the Duggars. Remember, they do have 19 kids. They are losing an estimated $25 million a year in salaries and licensing fees as reality show stars, plus the royalties and the sponsorships and the speaking engagements. And this is just the most shameful possible way to try to now recover the money they lost for their involvement in covering up child sex abuse, going to a television channel and saying, listen, we are going to ignore for now that we were involved in the cover-up of child sex abuse in our family. We want to do a show where we are framed positively as the experts. We're going to counsel people on how to deal with child sex abuse. There is, I don't know yet. We don't yet know whether TLC is seriously considering doing this show. I seriously hope that TLC is not stupid enough to say, okay, we canceled the show because of your involvement in child sex abuse. It would be really stupid to now bring you back as experts on the topic of child sex abuse. Let's hope that that does not happen. We're going to keep an eye on it. The most stunning thing here is just the gall, right? The audacity of this family to come back and say, here's a new way to make money. After we covered up child sex abuse, pay us to frame us as experts on counseling people through child sex abuse. Disgusting.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Marc Hyden, who's the National Advocacy Coordinator with conservatives concerned about the death penalty. He comes most recently from the National Rifle Association, where he was campaign field representative in the state of Florida. You know, Marc, I think this is probably the first time on the show that we're having a former NRA person on because we just agree with you so much from the conservative side. And I think increasingly people are understanding that there's really nothing very conservative about the death penalty, is there?
Well, you're absolutely correct. When you look at the death penalty and you look at what principles conservatives hold dear, they just don't line up. Conservatives believe in pro-life policies, but the death penalty risks innocent life. Conservatives also believe in fiscal responsibility and restraint, but the death penalty is far more expensive than life without parole, and it's even led to tax increases. And we also believe in limited government, but I don't believe there's anything limited or wise about giving an error-prone state the power to kill its citizens. So I think it's antithetical to conservative principles.
And this idea of the government having as little involvement as possible, if we sort of think of the conservative idea of the government should take the smallest action possible to have the best possible outcome. I was recently looking at a study showing that harsher sentences, including the death penalty, do not actually have a deterrent effect on crime and do not actually improve the sort of status quo around crime. So why would the government take what I think we would all agree is a bigger action, right? The putting to death of someone, if we are not even getting that desired impact of either deterrence or whatever else it may be?
Well, conservatives like to do cost-benefit analyses, and I like to do the same. So I asked myself, for a big broken government program like the death penalty that has a high human and fiscal cost, what do we get out of this? What's our bang for the buck? And truthfully, we don't get much. You're right. The death penalty does not deter murder. The states that are the perennial leaders in executions actually have the highest murder rates. And if you look at states like New York and New Jersey, their murder rates actually went down once they repealed the death penalty. But if you go beyond public safety, because we know the death penalty doesn't deter, you also are confronted with the fact that the system is very harmful on murder victims' friends and family members because of the long, drawn-out process and the incessant media attention.
There's another way. I read about your position on how the death penalty fails the families of the victims. I think there's another way to consider also, which is that when you say, well, certain types of crimes are worthy of the death penalty and others that may appear just as heinous, but maybe it doesn't involve a multiple murder. It was just a single murder. Doesn't it, in a sense, risk devaluing the sort of the victims of what has been determined to be a crime that's not quite bad enough for the death penalty, but bad enough for life without parole? It starts to sort of categorize the different victims and affect their families as well.
It does, and conservatives, we pride ourselves on valuing life, but that kind of valuation is inappropriate. It's saying some lives are worth more than others, and that's how the death penalty works. It's very arbitrary. If you look at the race of the victim, if it's a white person who may or may not have been murdered by a person of color, there's a higher likelihood that it's going to turn out as a death penalty case as opposed to life without parole. And that goes back to, Lady Justice is supposed to be blind, but apparently she's not colorblind.
So let's talk a little bit about what you think, as someone who is working within the conservative world, as to why the death penalty is so appealing to many on the right. Broadly, I've talked about this idea that exists on the right with regard to many social policies of sort of strict father morality, as George Lakoff has put it, which is we're going to put aside for a second, as you said, the cost-benefit analyses. We're going to put aside for a second the facts on deterrence, because sometimes we just have this innate sense that people deserve to be punished in a way that we see fit. Am I onto something there? Is there some other explanation that you see as to why so many on the right really like the death penalty?
I had a conversation at the North Carolina GOP convention. Someone came up to me and they said, I support the death penalty because I think that some people just deserve to die. And I told them, I'm not going to argue with that line of thinking. That's your own opinion. But do you trust an error-prone government to fairly, efficiently, and properly administer this program when you don't trust it to deliver a piece of mail? And the light bulb went off in his head and he walked away being against the death penalty. We have to look at this program not in a theoretical framework, but how our government actually operates it. And it operates it in a very, very flawed fashion.
Is that, in your mind, the best way, speaking as a conservative who has convinced other conservatives that the death penalty is a bad idea, Is taking a sort of we don't trust the government approach the best way to change other conservatives' mind on this? Because there's so many arguments that could be made, right? There's the cost argument. There's the risk of innocent life argument, and we've seen increased data that suggests 1 out of 25 on death row is not guilty of the crime they've been convicted of. What, in your mind, is the best argument? And maybe that one is it, which is, listen, we don't trust the government, and we don't want them putting the death penalty on anybody.
Well, I found that one to be very convincing, but for me, it's the preponderance of the evidence. I used to support the death penalty, but once I looked at it in a conservative framework and I noticed all of the problems, all of them together is what pushed me to finally come out against the death penalty. And, each person is different. Some people are led by the cost arguments, which I'm a fiscal conservative as well, but others are not swayed by that, but they're swayed by the life issues or just their distrust of government. So every person is different, but there's no shortage of reasons to oppose the death penalty.
Nebraska is a recent conservative state that has repealed the death penalty, and your organization played a role there. What is it that you do on the ground to try to get a repeal going? I mean, what are the sort of logistics involved?
Well, it takes years of planning, and our involvement in Nebraska was part of a broader coalition. So there were a lot of different organizations that were involved, and it went on for years. They were working with legislators, persuading them, showing them the information about the death penalty. But they were also working, and I was working as well, with the grassroots and grass tops in Nebraska to get them to contact their legislators and let them know which way they should be voting. They should be voting the way of their conscience. They should be voting the way of their principles. And after years of pushing towards this, Nebraska finally repealed the death penalty, and they did so by overturning a filibuster as well as a veto override, and became the first red state in over 40 years to repeal the death penalty.
So what can individuals do who still live in states with the death penalty? Is starting with their most local of legislators the way to go, writing to senators and U.S. members of Congress?
Well, I'm a conservative, and I like to think that politics is best done on a local level, on a state-by-state legislative basis, and that's our focus, is to try to repeal the death penalty at the state level, because that's where it's used the most. Only 3 people have been executed at the federal level in the modern era, so mainly it comes from the state level, especially states like Texas. So I recommend, they contact me, go to our website, sign up, and also reach out to their state representatives and state legislators and start a grassroots movement in their own local areas.
Is there some hope, even though, as you say, most of these decisions are made at the state level, that we could see what happened with marriage equality happen with the death penalty, which is at a certain point it becomes very clear that at the state level there is this preponderance of desire, so to speak, across the country to say no more death penalty, where there might be some sort of federal or Supreme Court ruling on it. I guess the question would be, what kind of a case could broadly challenge the death penalty to the Supreme Court? That's where I see sort of a tough hill to climb. But is there some possibility of federal action on this?
I mean, there's always a chance. I mean, capital cases are going to the Supreme Court with regularity, and since Justice Roberts has been put in place, I've given up on trying to figure out which way they're going to rule on anything. So it's always a possibility that the Supreme Court will weigh in. Recently, they looked at the Glossop case having to do with the potential of cruel and unusual punishment. And some of the more left-leaning justices came out pretty much opposed to the death penalty and stated the many reasons why they can't support it regardless of that individual case. So there's always the possibility that in the coming years that a Supreme Court ruling may come down and end the death penalty nationally.
Last thing I want to touch on, as a conservative who on this particular issue sides more with the sort of prevailing left-leaning opinion in the U.S., on what other issues do you find yourself having maybe more natural allies on the left?
Well, we're a single-issue organization, so I usually...
No, but you personally, I mean.
Oh, me personally? Well, I believe in limited government, and sometimes that means that I align more with libertarians as well as some on the left. There's a multitude of issues that could come out from that, but when it comes to my voting, it's usually pretty much, or it's always on the Republican line.
Yeah, that I'm not at all surprised to hear. All right, we've been speaking with Marc Hyden. He's the National Advocacy Coordinator with conservatives concerned about the death penalty. Thank you so much for talking to us about this.
David, thanks for having me on.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Matt sent me a great article. He wrote to me. He said, at first I thought this was a joke from The Onion. I guess not. Shameful and ignorant action on the part of the Arkansas government. What Matt is talking about is that Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson has directed the Department of Health and Human Services to terminate its existing Medicaid contracts with Planned Parenthood of the Heartland, which covers Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma, according to a press release from his office. It stated the termination will be effective 30 days from Friday, August 14th, saying in a statement, it is apparent that after the recent revelations on the actions of Planned Parenthood that this organization does not represent the values of the people of our state, and Arkansas is better served by terminating any and all existing contracts with them. This includes their affiliated organization, Planned Parenthood of Arkansas and Eastern Oklahoma. The Arkansas House of Representatives Republican Caucus jumped on top of this, releasing a statement saying, the House Republican Caucus concurs in the decision by Governor Hutchinson to end Medicaid funding for Planned Parenthood. This is government grandstanding, which not only could have real devastating consequences for women who rely on Planned Parenthood for birth control and cancer screenings and STD tests, this might actually backfire on Republicans. Tomorrow, we're going to have a report for you about how most of what Planned Parenthood does is overwhelmingly supported by American women. So when we take 3% of what Planned Parenthood does is abortion and abortion-related services, there's only a slight majority in this country that supports that, which, by the way, is a record since Roe v. Wade. Let's put that aside. When we go to the 97% of what Planned Parenthood does, most of what they do is very uncontroversial and widely supported by women in the United States. In fact, by all Americans, men and women in the United States. So not only, Lewis, could these now grandstanding actions to cut funding to Planned Parenthood negatively affect women, there's a very good chance that going forward, they will backfire politically for the right as well. All right, Lewis's audio is gone. So we are going to continue along. I thought we had you back, Lewis, but sadly we did not. So we will check in with Lewis a little bit later. Now, as a final just note on this, to put a cherry on top, Medicaid funding is prohibited by law from being put towards abortions, except in cases of rape, incest, or to protect the life of the mother. So the undertone of the opposition to Planned Parenthood and the funding of it is, well, we don't want any tax dollars going towards abortions. That's already the case, broadly speaking, and the only exception with regard to Medicaid funding is rape, incest, or the life of the mother. So that has become yet another way in which Republicans have successfully made what should be a very uncontroversial organization doing widely uncontroversial stuff a wedge with which to divide people and to garner political donations. We've talked about the war on the poor many times. It's one of the actual real wars in this country, in contrast to, for example, the war on Christmas, which happens to not be real, or the war on Christianity, which happens to not be real, or the war on the rich, which happens to not be real. The war on the poor is a real thing. And last week, the Department of Justice argued as much in a statement of interest that it filed in a pretty obscure case in Boise, Idaho, which could end up affecting how cities regulate and punish homelessness. Boise, like many cities, has an ordinance that bans sleeping or camping in public places, which of course directly targets homeless people. But such laws, like the Department of Justice says, effectively criminalize homelessness in situations where people have no place to sleep. The Department of Justice found, quote, when adequate shelter space exists, individuals have a choice about whether or not to sleep in public. However, when adequate shelter space does not exist, there is no meaningful distinction between the status of being homeless and the conduct of sleeping in public. Sleeping is a life-sustaining activity. It must occur at some time and in some place. If you have nowhere to go, as is the case if there are not shelters available or space in shelters available, then the enforcement of these anti-camping or anti-sleeping in public ordinances effectively criminalizes being homeless. Obviously, the Department of Justice is pointing to the Eighth Amendment protection against cruel and unusual punishment, which would suggest that banning homeless people from sleeping in public is flat out unconstitutional. We will see what happens with this. This could be really, really big, as Eric Tars, who's a senior attorney for the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, says. However, I want to issue this caveat, which was something I read from Terrence McCoy in the Washington Post. This will not really stop the criminalization of homelessness for two reasons. McCoy says, first of all, cities are actively expanding other laws that target the homeless population. This includes everything from increasing prohibitions on panhandling, for example, or loitering, or loafing, or vagrancy. The number of bans on those activities has increased drastically. And yes, we can say, fine, you can sleep in public because sleeping is something people have to do at some point at some place. But the other activities are still going to be enforced, at least it appears they will be. And number two, there is this other element of stigma around homelessness in this country. And even if you pass a law saying, or even if you say you cannot pass laws banning sleeping in public, that's a great step. But ultimately, it is not going to change the real and significant stigma that exists in the United States around homelessness. This is a huge, huge war. One battle here, the one about sleeping in public, is maybe going in the right direction. I hope that it is. I've actually been feeling particularly guilty and bad lately when I see people panhandling, particularly it's so hot now in the heat. And the worst part of it is really the feeling that I can do very little. I think the best thing I can do is on this program, continue talking about poverty, continue talking about how so many of the poverty issues we have, including hunger, are optional issues, and hoping to catalyze change in that way. Because even if I go to my bank account, raid my bank account of as much money as I can and start handing $20 to every homeless person I see, even their lives are only going to be impacted temporarily by that $20. And it is not going to impact the broad problem, which is the stigma and lack of attention being paid to homelessness. So I've been talking to a lot of people about it when I drive by with whoever it is I'm driving with, someone who's panhandling in the heat. They clearly look beaten down. And I don't know. How do you deal with that? What feelings do you have? I know some people are very good at sort of shutting it out and saying, hey, listen, there's people on all parts of the economic spectrum, and there's going to be poverty, period, and sort of disconnecting from it. I don't know what it is, but it's becoming increasingly tougher for me to do that. We have a phone number that you can call any time of day. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a voicemail I received yesterday.
Hey, David. My name is Chris. I'm 24. I just recently started listening to your show after a friend of mine showed me Hatriot Mail. And I was wondering if you could go into detail. I'm 24. I only had one chance to vote, and I didn't do it because I figured Obama would win. But people like me, my age, that haven't voted before, I was wondering if you could talk something about some way to try and explain why, like how we get out there, what would motivate people my age that have never voted to get out there and vote. So thanks for taking my call.
Okay, so from a purely mathematical perspective, the argument for young people voting is very simple, which is, on balance, the younger you are, the more years you expect to have left alive. Thus, the more time that your life will be affected by the decisions made by those who we elect. So the younger you are, the more you should be wanting to vote, because the decisions made by our elected officials will impact a 25-year-old for many more years than they will impact an 85-year-old. So that's that. Now, as far as specific issues, there are so many. If we look at income and wealth inequality and how it continues to build, the younger you are, unless we turn that trend around of increased wealth and income inequality, the more you are going to be affected by the increased income and wealth gap in this country. That is something that we can take action on now. The environment. The younger you are, the further into potential environmental disaster that you are going to live. So it is very important for you to be active now on turning around our impact on the climate. You can apply this logic in many ways. And of course, then we have issues that specifically affect young people. Access to contraception, access to affordable education, student loan reform, so many other areas. The younger you are, the more engaged there is there's an impetus for you to be even more engaged with politics. Unfortunately, it's the opposite. We see that the older you are, the more likely you are to regularly vote, and we've got to turn that around. On today's bonus show, Shell receives final approval to drill in the Arctic, a rape scandal at the prestigious St. Paul's School in New Hampshire, and air pollution in China is killing 4,000 people a day. All of those stories and more on the bonus show. If you'd like to see a sample bonus show, go to davidpakman.com/membership. Check out a sample bonus show. If you like it, most people do, maybe you won't. You can sign up for membership and get instant access to the full library of bonus shows and all other great member content. davidpakman.com/membership. Speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.